Okay, so um, we've mentioned sort of in passing a couple of times the personal statement, which is one of the things that you're going to have to do when you complete your UCAS application in the autumn. We haven't talked very much about it because in some ways it's not as big a hurdle as UCAT is, for example, or as the interview is, because it's not sort of the main thing that they will select you based on, but you are required to do it, and I think it does have to be sort of right. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. And then if we have time at the end, we'll also talk a little bit about the extent to which you ought to be sort of doing some wider reading around your, the subject that you're planning to apply for. Okay, so the personal statement is, as I say, something you have to do, and you write it whilst you're completing your UCAS application, which will be when you come back to college in the autumn. Although hopefully you'll have kind of drafted it before then, because it's a huge rush that couple of weeks when you come back. So if you're starting your personal statement from scratch, it can be a bit of a struggle. The personal statement has changed this year. It used to be that they just gave you a blank page and you could basically write whatever you wanted on it. But that's changed, and now they have specific questions that you have to answer, and we'll go through those in a minute. So that means that if you're talking to people, who've done it in the past, or you're looking at examples from the past, they're not sort of directly relevant because the structure has changed, although actually the content's not going to be very different. So it's about a side of A4 is the sort of length of thing that you have to write, but the actual limit they give you is 4,000 characters, and that's very strict. It just kind of stops accepting things if you go beyond that. So it ends up usually, for people applying for these kind of subjects, that the problem is that there's too much you want to say rather than that you can't think of enough things to fill up the space. It's usually a sort of tricky editing job getting it down to 4,000 characters. And just to say that they have very efficient plagiarism detection. So don't be tempted to look at examples of things that other people have written in the past and say, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say, and just copy it down, because they will pick that up and they will inform all the medical schools or whatever that you've applied to that you plagiarism has been detected, and therefore your chances are going to be seriously compromised. And it's just a case of putting things in your own words. It doesn't mean that it isn't worth looking at what people have said in the past and thinking, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say, but then you just rephrase it a bit and you'll be fine. Okay, so how much does it matter? Well, for dentistry, the trouble with dentistry is that they tend to be less than clear about exactly how they select people for interviewing dentistry. So they just make vague statements saying, yes, UCAT is important, yes, the personal statement is important, and they don't really tell you what the relative importance is. My feeling is that it's probably less important than UCAT is these days in dentistry, but everyone except Plymouth and Manchester imply that they at very least read it, and that it counts for something towards deciding who gets interviewed. So if you're applying for dentistry, I think the personal statement has to be pretty good. There is a big difference for medicine in that all of the medical schools except for Keele basically say we don't use it when we're selecting who we're going to interview, or at least we don't score it in the same way that we would score potentially your GCSEs or your UCAT in the way that we do for those things. We don't do that for your personal statement. Keele is an exception. They have this very strong line that they think that the experience you've had leading up to your application is the most important thing that they need to know about in deciding who's going to be a good candidate. And so they read your personal statement in huge detail and give it a score according to various sort of things that they think are important. And that, along with your UCAT, basically then decides if you've got an interview. And it means, in effect, that their UCAT cutoff is quite a lot lower than other places if you've got a good personal statement. So what happens is everybody who's had a bad day on UCAT will apply to Keele. So it's very competitive, but it does work. You know, we've had people this year and several people last year who had disappointing UCAT, but who ended up getting offers from Keele. So it's worth knowing that. And again, because that's something you may have to fall back on, you know, for that reason alone, it's worth having a good personal statement put together. But even for everywhere else, I think there are reasons for thinking it's worth getting it right. Because a lot of the universities say, well, we don't score it, but we do read it. And you think, well, okay, so what's the point? And I guess what that means is they're looking for red flags. So, you know, if you express an interest in Nazism or something, it probably counts against you. So things like that, they probably will pick up on. Or just really, if it contains no information to suggest that you're really very interested in the subject or that you've done any preparation for it, those are the kind of things they're probably looking for. And then they say things like, we may use it to help in borderline cases. And you have no idea whether that means, you know, once in a blue moon, they have a tricky tie-break situation, or whether that's actually dozens of people every year. You just can't tell. So I think we have to assume that it has to be pretty good because you might be in one of those borderline cases. If you're going to apply to Oxford or Cambridge, almost certainly they will read it because you're applying to an individual college rather than the whole university, they have a much smaller pool of people that they have to consider. And so they've got the time to read all the personal statements properly. And they may well talk to you about it during your interview. So if you're applying there, then it's definitely got to be good. Manchester, for example, and Sunderland, one or two other places, send out their own sort of equivalent of the personal statement form once you've already applied. And they do it that way because it asks specific questions rather than, you know, which of what they want to know about, rather than the personal statement, which might not answer the questions that they're interested in. In reality, though, if you sort of put your statement together in the way that we're going to suggest you do, it will actually have covered most of the questions on the Manchester form, for example. So putting the personal statement together helps you do that form. And the thing is, with those forms, they don't give you very long to do them. So once you've applied, they'll send you the form, and they might say, you know, you've got 4 days to complete it and send it back. So if you've already done your personal statements, it really helps. And finally, and actually for many people, this is probably the most important thing, is that this is a chance to take stock of where you're up to in your interview preparation. Because the kind of stuff that you're going to talk about in your personal statement is the same kind of stuff you're going to need to be ready to talk about in your interview. So just putting it together for this will help you in your interview preparation. Okay, all of which adds up to saying that although when you look at the prospectus, particularly for medicine, not so much for dentistry, they'll say the personal statement isn't all that important. I think it potentially is, so you need to make sure you get it right. So if you talk to people who are having the mainstream reach classes rather than the medical ones, they will get told totally different stuff about the personal statement. So it's very important that you recognize that that's because there is a genuine difference. And so don't kind of take the advice that they've been given. In particular, they will be told that you need to say lots about what you've learned from your A-level subjects and why you're interested in them and that kind of stuff. And in medicine dentistry, they couldn't care less about your A-level subjects. All they want is that you get A's in them, but they're not interested in the content. So there is no point saying much or anything about them, and that's a really important difference. Also, again, in the mainstream reach, they'll be told that if you're applying for competitive places, you have to have done masses of wider reading around the subject that you're interested in and convince them that way that you're really enthusiastic about it. Again, it's not clear that that's really very important for medicine. And again, unless you're applying to Oxbridge. We'll talk a little bit about wider reading later on, but it's not going to be a massive thing for you because essentially they're interested in your personal experience, you know, what you've learned about all these things we've been talking about recently about empathy and communication and all that kind of stuff. That's what they're really interested in. And so you don't have the space to talk about, some cool new bit of medicine that you've been reading about or something like that, because you'll end up not saying enough about what they're really interested in. And Oxbridge is the exception to that, because their course is more academically focused than other places. They will probably expect that you've done some wider reading, so then it's important to say a little bit about it. But for everywhere else, I'm not at all discouraging you from doing wider reading, but I am saying you don't need to write a lot about it in your personal statement. Dentistry, again, is slightly different. I think they always emphasize that they look for, awareness of what's happening in dentistry, how it's moving on. So doing some wider reading probably is kind of important in dentistry. And you don't write a huge amount about it. Mainly it's about what you yourself have done, what you yourself have seen. So that's a massive difference. But it's personal statement is going to be focused mainly on convincing them that you're going to be good at working with people, meaning both patients and your colleagues, that you understand the NHS that you'll be going on to work in and so on, that kind of stuff. All the people side of it, not the science side of it. Okay, so the new personal statement structure this year has 3 specific questions, which we'll go through. And the way it works is that although it asks 3 questions, you still have this overall limit of 4,000 characters. So it's up to you how much you write for each question. And as you'll see, I'm going to suggest that you'll have a very unequal division between the 3 questions. So those are the 3. Why do you want to study this course? How have your qualifications and studies helped you get ready for it? And what else have you done to get ready for it? So we need to think about each of those, and we'll go through them one by one, but those are the 3 you have to get ready for. So here's the first one then. Why do you want to study this course or subject? So this obviously is an important one. We talked about the fact that when you get for interview, you have to be ready to talk about your motivation. So again, this is useful, if nothing else, for making you think about how am I going to talk about it when I get to the interview, even if no one reads your personal statement. So on the one hand, it's got to sound that you're really committed and enthusiastic. You can't sound like there's any doubt about what this is really what you want to do. Because they take the view that by taking on medicine or dentistry, you're taking on a tougher course than most other people will be taking on. And they don't want to take on people who are iffy about it because they don't want you to drop out. So they need to be convinced that this is absolutely this and nothing else that you want to do. On the other hand, you can't do that by just sounding as if you think every day is going to be brilliant and wonderful, because they want to see that you realize that there are downsides to it, that it is tough in various ways, and that there will be days that are very much not brilliant. So you've got to have that balance of sounding realistic, but in spite of the downsides, 100% committed. And that's the sort of stance that you're aiming to come across with. And you can do that in lots of different ways. So what I'll do is just show you some examples of things which I've written, but are based on the kinds of things that various people have said over the years. So, as I say, obviously, you'll have access to this, but don't copy these out, whatever you do, because that would be plagiarism. So this was a sort of very general statement that sort of aims specifically to cover those points you said. So just have a read of that and decide whether you think that's good or not good. Any thoughts on that? Like about it or don't like about it? Yeah. No, that's right. It's very sort of generic, isn't it? You can kind of tell that it's been put together to sort of think, I've got to mention this, I've got to mention this, and it's kind of ticking all the boxes. But as you say, it doesn't seem very personal, and I think that's a weakness. So a sort of contracted version of that coupled to some specific account, as you say, of what the specific things that have motivated you might be reasonable. But if that was all you said about it, I don't think someone reading it, they would sort of say, yeah, that's a well-constructed paragraph, but I don't think I really believe that's what you think. That seems reasonable. I think you want to make it more personal than that. Okay, so let's look at another one. So one of the things you can do is to sort of talk about the road that led you there. In other words, it might not be that you've always wanted to do medicine, it might be that you've had different ideas in the past. So here's an example of that. Any thoughts on that one? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think this is a big step forward from the first one, but you're right that what it lacks is a sort of perspective on the downsides of it. But I think you could do that by adding to it rather than by going back to the drawing board. So I think if you've got a story like that to tell where it isn't what you've always wanted to do, then talking about what you did used to want to do and sort of what's made the difference is quite a good thing to do. I like the idea that you haven't drifted into it, that you've made a positive decision, and so hearing about that makes a difference. And you can see if it were to come up at interview, you've got more to say then with a story like that than you have if you're just making generalizations. And the other thing it does is that the big trap that lots of people fall into is they just effectively say, I like science, I'm really good at it, but I want to do something useful with it. Therefore, I'm going to do dentistry or something. And obviously, that's nonsense because you can do all kinds of useful things with science that don't involve, drilling into people's heads and stuff. So it's good because it explains explicitly what the difference is, that you're not abandoning science, but that you want to help individual people rather than, developing drugs that may help huge numbers of people, but you won't have the contact with those people as individuals. I think that's an important point to bring across. But as you say, it lacks balance, so it would need adding to a little bit. And then third example, this one is sort of a more personal story. And a lot of people do this, and it's absolutely fine to do this if you've got uh, someone you know, or it may be yourself, who's had experiences that have inspired you. Okay, so that kind of approach. I think it's a good thing to do. I think you have to be very careful with it. We talked last time about the difference between empathy and sympathy, and we said in general sympathy is a dangerous thing. So it would be easy to write something like that along the lines of, I've had this friend who's got this terrible disease and I feel really sorry for her, so I'd like to help people in that kind of situation. And that's kind of weak, because that's kind of saying that you're just focusing on, um, you know, having sympathy for someone and you haven't really thought through what the job involves and that kind of stuff. So you have to be very careful with that and make sure that, like that one does, what it does is sort of say, well, this person talked to me about the doctors and people who treated her, and I was inspired by the ones that did the empathy thing and that kind of stuff. So it says, yeah, I have understood what the job really involves. So I think that can be a really good approach again, and it just depends. So you can be talking about yourself, and that's fine as well. If you've been through something, or people in your family or whatever. So yeah, there are lots of ways to do this. Long QT syndrome is a real thing, actually, which is kind of scary because I know very vaguely who a child who's been diagnosed with this. And when I read up about it, the symptoms, and it says the first symptom is usually sudden death. Kind of scary. But anyway. So that was the first question. So it takes a bit of thinking about. I think it probably wants to be maybe a quarter of your statement. So, it's not just a couple of sentences, but it's not the most important bit. The second question then, how have your qualifications and studies helped you prepare for this course? So, as we said, they're not interested in your A-levels. So I think that you don't really want to say much about them at all. Historically, where you just have the one page to fill in, I used to advise people not even to mention their A-levels. It's difficult to know now because they've specifically asked the question. I think you could just leave it blank and say, I've got nothing to say about this, but they might possibly think that was a bit weird. So I suspect it may be worth just putting in a short sentence and something like that, which doesn't really say very much, but which possibly just leaves you feeling, less awkward than you would if you just didn't say anything at all. So that's the problem with having these generic questions, because if someone's applying for physics or philosophy or whatever it might be, then they're very interested in how your journey through A-level has led you to that, but they're not for your subject. So that's the kind of thing I think you could possibly write. What I would add to that, though, is that if you've done any additional studying, in other words, if you've outside your A-levels decided to investigate something else, and it could be if you're doing an EPQ. I know most of you are not, because it's difficult to find the time to do that, but that would be obviously something that would be worth talking more about if it's relevant to your subject. There are lots of sort of online courses that you could potentially do. Do you know what MOOCs are? Well, there are these things called MOOCs, M-O-O-C, which is I don't know what it stands for, massive online course. But anyway, they're basically online courses delivered by proper academics and stuff. So it's not some sort of crank just trying to raise some money based on his personal conspiracy theories or something. It's they're proper academics, and they will take you through courses. Some of them you pay for, and it's absolutely not worth doing any of those. But quite a lot of them are free, and you could find one that's interesting on some aspect of medicine or dentistry and study that, and then you could talk about that here, and that would be a way to do it. Personally, though, I think that the one thing that possibly is doing is to sort of, rather than be a kind of passive recipient of something like an online course, is to actually say, do your own research, you know, decide on something you're interested in, and just use the internet yourself to find information about it and try and build up an understanding on it. So, for example, you know, sometimes people just pick something random and it always looks a little bit awkward and you think, well, why are you particularly interested in that? So quite a good thing to do is to pick something you've come across, maybe because it's somebody you know who's got a particular condition or has had a particular experience in health, or, you know, somebody you've met during your work experience or volunteering or whatever. And so an obvious example, which we'll explore a little bit later, is if you've spent any time on the wards in the hospital or in care homes particularly, you've probably come across people with dementia. Or you may just, you know, have people in your family that suffer from dementia. And, you know, an obvious question would be, I'd like to understand more about how dementia happens and maybe try to understand why at the moment it's incurable. What are the prospects? So, you know, that would be the kind of thing which would be then easier to build into a statement than just kind of picking some random topic and talking about that. So at the end of the thing, we'll talk a little bit about how you could pursue an interest like that. But again, what people then tend to do is say, I read this paper by X and then I read this paper by Y. And they're not going to be impressed by the fact that you've read them. What they're interested in is your reflections on them, just the same as with your volunteering and stuff. And you probably don't have very much space to devote to that. So again, unless you're applying for Oxbridge, where they are going to expect you to have done something like this, then if you decided that you didn't want to devote space to it, I think that would be absolutely fine. So there's an example of something which you could perhaps include, which just sort of alludes to the fact that you have done some wider reading, but doesn't take an awful lot of space getting you know, into the details. So, you know, that's just an example which would fit in quite nicely if you happen to have talked about working with autistic people as part of the experience you've been through yourself, you know, particularly. That would be good. And, you know, the point it makes is absolutely the way it is, that there have been thousands of studies looking for links to particular genes and finding links to particular genes, but there are literally, I think, hundreds of genes with weak links to autism and no genes with very strong links. So the picture is really complicated. And you know, the general point it makes, therefore, that understanding complicated diseases isn't always as simple as just sort of saying, right, you know, this is the organism that causes it, so we've just got to kill that organism and then we'll be fine. Not like that. Okay, so we'll come back to wider reading at the end, but essentially it's a sort of optional thing to talk about unless you're applying to Oxford. So then we come to the third question, and this is the big one. So what else have you done to prepare outside of education, and why are these experiences helpful? So this is where you're going to talk about work experience and volunteering and your individual, you know, sort of leisure time activities, and draw out of those your understanding of empathy and communication skills and that kind of stuff. And that was always what the bulk of the personal statement was in the past. And so I think this is going to be the one you're going to want to spend most space on in the new world. So they don't just want a list of what you've done. Okay, so it's not about saying, you know, I spent 3 weeks shadowing this doctor, and then I spent 6 months, you know, volunteering at this place, and then I spent, you know, whatever. They don't really care about how much time you spent or the details of the particular places where you've done these things. It's the reflections they're interested in. So you need to make sure that's what you focus on rather than um, lots of lists of things. And if you've done shadowing and stuff, they're not that interested in the sort of technical things that you've seen. So, you know, don't start, you know, if you're doing a dentistry thing, you know, don't start sort of talking in detail about, you know, how you do root canal surgery or stuff like that. Because, you know, they know that already. You're not telling them anything about you. You're just telling them about stuff they already know if you do that. So it's about the patient interactions, the colleague interactions that they really want to hear. So here's an example then of using stuff that you've done outside of your education to show that you understand about empathy and effective communication. See what you make of that one. Okay, so any thoughts about that? Okay, so I mean, I think um, it does answer the question, because remember, you're supposed to be talking about what you have done outside of education, and it does that. So it talks about your part-time job and about the volunteering you've done. And in both cases, it tries to reflect on what you've learned from that. So it's doing all the right things. But there's one thing it doesn't do, which when we talked about this last week in the interview context, we said made a huge difference. Remember what was the thing that had made things like this much more compelling to listen to in that case, or to read in this case, it actually doesn't do. Well, what it doesn't do is talk about individual incidents or individual people. So if you're talking about, you know, dealing with difficult customers, it has much more impact if you can identify a particular customer where the way you worked with them made a difference. And I think people are more likely to sit up and take notice when you can talk about a particular person, or, you know, with the autistic children at the primary school, if you can talk about, you know, one person, for example, who may have been very, you know, unwilling to participate at the beginning, and then talk about how you managed to find a way to, like I said at the top, get on their wavelength and get them to interact with you. That has more impact than just the generic stuff. Actually, that's hard to do in a personal statement just because you haven't got very much space. And it may be that you don't end up saying anything very individual like that just because you haven't got the space to do it. But if you can, it's worth doing. But especially because, as I said, part of the point of doing this is that it's sort of the first step on preparing yourself for interview. And you have to remember that that's what it doesn't have, which you really do want to have at interview, is, you know, being as chatty as you can, talking about specific things that happened, rather than sort of generalizations that have occurred to you. But I think generally that does a pretty good job, because it shows that you've got varied experience, and that from all of these experiences you've drawn some things. But again, you know, when you've written that, you'd have to then sort of think, like, what have I talked about? So you say, well, I've talked about empathy. I've talked about, well, mainly empathy actually, but I guess communication skills a little bit. But you haven't really talked about teamwork at all. So you then have to think, right, I've got to either expand those examples to talk about teamwork, or I've got to find something else to talk about. You know, so sort of have this checklist of what the important things are. and make sure that everything's covered. Because I suspect that Keele, for example, when they score these things, they do sort of have that checklist, and they sort of give you points um, for each one of them that you've sort of reflected on. So then work experience. So as we've said, work experience can be shadowing, but it can also be online work experience, or just, it can be just having had conversations with medical professionals, or it can even just be sort of having read about things. And for medicine, I think you just need to have something in your personal statement that shows that you've made an effort to find out what life is really like as a doctor, and just mention that somewhere in your statement. But again, highlight the people related things, the teamwork, responsibility, coping with stress, not how impressed you were with their ability to operate on someone's brain or something, which might be much more what did impress you at the time, but they don't want to hear about it. And for dentistry, again, the work experience is probably going to take a bigger chunk of it for dentistry. They set a lot of store by what you've learned from observing dentists doing what they do. But again, same emphasis on the people side of it more than on the technical side of it. So here's an example of medicine one. Like that. Yeah, I mean, it's like that very first one we looked at when we were doing the motivation thing, that it looks like it's carefully constructed to tick all the boxes, and it does that, but it doesn't do it in a very personal way. So it doesn't sort of have the impact factor. So you probably get the ticks, but you're not going to sort of leave the person with a sort of, oh, this person really seems committed from that, because you can't read that into it. You get that much more if you talk about something individual. But it's basically fine. So we talked then about the sort of that you have to talk about empathy. You also have to talk about teamwork and responsibility, and again, try to relate that not so much to what you observed in the work experience. You can mention it there, but they really want to know what your own experience of it is. Okay, so although work experience shadowing is useful, it's not going to occupy a big chunk of this statement. They're much more interested in what you've learned from stuff that you yourself have been involved in. So you need to talk about something which allows you to discuss what it takes to work successfully in a team, but also remember that, as we said, it's a sort of special case when you're a doctor or a dentist, because you have particular higher level of responsibility than probably a lot of the people do in that team. So ultimately, for example, if it's a discussion of what's the best way forward with a patient, you're going to need to absolutely rely on the expertise of all the other people in the team, the nurses and the radiographers and so on. But in the end, you're going to be responsible for making sure that the right decision is made. So talking about taking responsibility is important as well. So, and I mentioned that at the bottom, that some of you have probably done things where you've sort of, I don't know, played sport at a really high level, or done drama in some sort of high profile production or something like that, won prizes for things. if you've done those, then obviously you want to put them in. You don't want people not to know that you've done these things, because it does say something about you that you've obviously got, you know, determination and ability and stuff. But equally, it's not going to make a huge difference. So don't worry if you haven't done anything that sort of, you know, got you into the national press, because they don't mind. So if you've done it, great, put it in, but don't worry about it if you haven't, because most people haven't. It's not really going to have a massive impact on their chance. Okay, so here's an example of a teamwork one. Okay, so that one, again, it's a little bit generic, doesn't talk about any individual people, but it's I think making pretty good use of your experience. One of the things that people waste a lot of space doing, you know, if you think that first sentence, so you played rugby, success depends on knowing where your fellow players are and being able to rely on them doing their jobs. It's obviously kind of implying that understanding that's important, because it's going to be kind of like that in a medical team. But you don't have to say that. Lots of people will follow that up by saying, this is just like working in a hospital or something. And first of all, they'll say, well, actually, no, it isn't really that, hopefully. Similar to being on a rugby pitch most of the time. I mean, so there are analogies, but it's not just like it. Or, you know, this demonstrates that I will be effective working in a medical team. And again, you know, that's for them to decide. You don't have to tell them what this demonstrates. And that's one of the things that I think you need to avoid. Generally, the things that, you know, when you send me drafts of your personal statement, I'll have my red pen ready. And the things I cross out straight away usually are, this shows that. Because I think, well, if you've written it well, it'll be obvious what it shows. You don't need to tell them. And it just looks, it reads so much better if you just kind of leave them to draw the inferences. The other thing about that is that they focus more on the sort of helping out other people than their own experience. So it's just to make the point that if you get the chance within whatever activities you do to take on a little bit of extra responsibility, or even if you feel that you do take it on but in an informal way, so, you know, within a rugby team there are going to be you know, there's the person who's officially the captain, but you know that there are going to be people who are sort of inspirational and lead the others and stuff like that. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a formal thing, but if you can find a way to talk about responsibility that you've had, that's important to try and bring in. So if you do get opportunities, you know, as in this case, to maybe help out with junior teams or something, or you know, if it's a part-time job, if you get the opportunity to help train someone new, anything like that, and you can use that then as a vehicle for talking about responsibility, and that's quite good. Being a member of a team is one thing, but having responsibility within that team is something else. Okay, so I think that's, again, making quite good use of something that's essentially just a part-time activity and using it to illustrate one of the skills that you know they think is important. So then you need to talk about the downsides of the job, and the stress. And you need to say a little bit explicitly about why being a dentist or being a doctor is stressful, although you don't want to go on about it at enormous length. But they do want to see that you're aware that that's a real issue. But then they want to know what makes you think you're going to be able to cope with stress. So talking about the things you do that help you cope with stress is also really important. Do that. Any thoughts on that? Did you do a good job of dealing with the stress issue? And I think it's reasonable balance because it begins by sort of saying, yes, I do understand that this job is going to be stressful. And you're going to talk about the same kinds of things um, for dentistry as well, although hopefully fewer of your patients might die if you're a dentist. But essentially the stresses are the same. Although, you know, dentists tend to be sort of running their own business, whereas most doctors are not. So again, there are differences, other things that you could talk about in that sort of case. But then it goes on to sort of say, well, okay, so you have to have mechanisms for coping with that. And I think it sort of talks about the two sides of that, which I think we've mentioned before, important. Talking about the fact that you have to not bottle things up, that you have to share your experience with others is really important. So that's a part of the teamwork thing. But then you also have to have things that take you right away from your work. And just try to say something about, you know, rather than just listing what you do, sort of say something about why those things are effective at relieving stress. And it sort of does that, although very briefly in talking about the rugby. You know, when I'm in need of quieter relaxation, I enjoy painting watercolors. You might think, well, that doesn't really say anything about stress relief. It's just a kind of list of something that you do. So maybe that could have been expanded a little bit. But it is difficult. 4,000 characters is not nearly enough to do all the things you want to do. And so you end up quite often ending up with something that's a bit like this. So it's chopped down from what you'd really want to say. And you just have to remind yourself everybody's going to be in the same boat there. But it's important you've got that kind of coverage in there somewhere, explaining that you know what the problems are with the job and explaining that you think you're going to be ready for them because you have your own ways of coping with stress. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the personal statement for now. In terms of the practicalities of it, as I said, when you get back in September, it's about a month before the formal deadline for getting your application in. But because it takes us a lot of time to process your forms, realistically, you've got about 2 weeks to actually get your form together once you get back. The college will tell you that there's a formal deadline, which is about 3 days after you get back. Just between you and me, that's not a real deadline, at least as far as you're concerned, because it's mainly me who's going to process your form, and I'm not going to insist on you doing it quite that quickly. But you've got sort of 1 to 2 weeks comfortably when you get back. And if you are already not too far away from your personal statement being in place, that's not difficult to achieve. It's people who haven't thought about it at all that can find that 2-week window quite difficult. Because normally it sort of takes you doing a first draft, sending it to me, me making some comments, you ignoring most of them and producing a second draft, and then sending it to me again, and then me making the same comments that you ignored the first time, so that you can try and incorporate them this time, and that kind of stuff. So it normally goes to and fro a couple of times. The record I have is 13 times, but I'm hoping that you won't. That was back in the days when the personal statement was much more important than it is now. But that's the thing. So if you can start doing that over the summer, that would be great, because I'll be around for most of the summer, so you can just email me drafts and I'll get them back to you, and it just takes the pressure off when we get back in September if you can have got through that first draft stage. And the thing to do is don't sort of think, oh, I have to spend weeks and weeks on it really getting something polished before I send it off. I'd much rather see a first draft that you and I both know is still very much a work in progress. Because almost always the first draft gets covered in red ink, when I send it back to you. And if you've told me I've already spent, 57 hours polishing this, then I feel kind of bad when I sort of say, yeah, but unfortunately it's all rubbish. So just send me a first draft. And very often what people do is send something that's far too long, which of course I'm delighted to have to read, but that is quite an efficient way of doing it. If you say, these are the things I want to say, but I can't say all of them, which bits shall I chop? Then, I can tell you. So don't be frightened to do those kind of things. All I care about is that you don't come to me on the day before the actual deadline and say, oh, I haven't started my personal statement yet. That would be bad. Okay, so we talked a little bit about sort of wider reading and stuff, so I just thought to talk about that a little bit. So first of all, what's slightly different from sort of wider reading is kind of current awareness, knowing what's going on in the world. And I think that if you don't do this already, it's probably a good time to start making sure that you know about issues in the news that relate to medicine or dentistry or both. Because, it's embarrassing, particularly at the interview stage, if they ask you about something big that's been going on and you haven't heard about it before. So the difficulty with that is that you need to make sure that you use a reliable, unbiased source of news, as the extent that anything ever is unbiased. But there is an awful lot of very biased, very poorly informed stuff out there that you need to avoid. And then if you find something that's interesting, that would be a possible thing that you could then investigate further, again, if you want to show that you've done some wider reading. So particularly if you come across something that relates to your own experience, that might prompt you to think, oh yeah, I'll read up a bit more on that, and that would be a good thing to do. So if you identify a topic that you then want to investigate in detail, you need to sort of find information about it. And what people will often do is go and look for a book on the topic. And I don't actually think that's the best way to do wider reading in this kind of subject for various reasons. One is that books tend to get out of date very quickly. Medical science moves on very fast. So if you read a book, from 2005, it's likely to be hopelessly out of date, even though it may look like quite a recent book. So I think that using the internet is much more the way to do that. And the other disadvantage of a book is that the person who's written it tends to have their own view of what's right. Whereas once you start researching things in the internet, most times you discover that people disagree wildly about what's the best way forward in finding treatments for things, and showing that you understand that you showing that medical science isn't something that's all sorted out and your job is just to find out about it. It's going on now and people disagree hugely about it, and that's important that they do. So again, not relying on a single source of information, I think, is important. So first of all, for that sort of current awareness stuff, these are just two suggestions of places that have quite good current awareness coverage. Most of the sort of, most newspapers have some kind of health coverage, and the coverage in some of the other sort of serious newspapers is probably as good as in the Guardian, but the Guardian has the advantage that it's free, whereas most of the other newspapers are not. And the BBC is also, it has slightly less coverage than the Guardian, but it's also free, and they're reasonably balanced. I mean, the Guardian obviously has a political stance, which is sort of left of centre, but I don't think that carries through into most of its health coverage, at least in a sort of extreme way. So those are good places to look. So I just picked the Guardian as an example, just to show you the kind of things that you can come across. So if you just do a Google search, the Guardian medicine, it will take you straight to the pages. And the Guardian's quite good because it organizes its website in ways that will take you to all of its medicine-related articles very effectively. So it's easy to use Google to find these things. So if you just pick one of those kind of things and then look on it, so there's a whole bunch of things you can see there, but this was an example just looking on their general health page, and this was this week. And you can see there are two articles there, both of which are really interesting in terms of big issues right now. So we talked a lot about the problems with the NHS in an earlier lesson, and we talked specifically about the A&E waiting times. So, there's an article that gives you a sort of update on that, and that's really useful because, you may have investigated it before using, based perhaps on the lesson we did or whatever, but that information was obviously a bit old, whereas here's a sort of current insight in that. And then the antibiotic crisis, you ought to be aware of that, doctors and dentists, both of you, that antibiotics are ceasing to work very well because we've handled their use very badly. And so knowing the danger in the future, which is that lots of people might be faced with infections that we can't treat, and it'll be back to the to the bad old days where every time you got an illness, you'd be in bed for a couple of weeks with the prospect you might never get out of it again. And so it's important, I think, that you know about that. So that was just a chance snapshot this week, but that shows you that these are useful. And then if you go to a different page, so this one was focusing on medical research rather than just health. So again, you get a different emphasis this time. So instead of sort of general health issues, it's about specific research developments. And I mentioned earlier about dementia, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. And you can see again, there's a very current development in dementia research there, which you can come across. So I think starting to do this, you don't need to spend hours and hours on it. It's just having a quick look at what's there and saying, oh yeah, that would be worth reading up. If you're interested, don't really need to read everything and know everything. But if you notice that issues keep coming up, or they just sound to you like they're really important, then reading them is worth doing. So, say wider study, there are lots of popular science books and things, and it's not that I would discourage you from reading them, but I think in the end, they're not that much impressed if you just sort of say, I read this book and it was really interesting, and they think, okay, that doesn't tell me anything about you. But if you say, I was really interested in this question, and I researched it, and I found, a whole bunch of articles on the internet, and they don't all agree, so I've realized that this is a big outstanding question, they're going to be more impressed by that. So that's the sort of thing that may be worth doing, especially, perhaps only, but especially if you're thinking of applying to Oxford. So I thought I'd just illustrate that by talking about an example of a question that might well have occurred to you, which is, as I say, if you've been working with people with dementia or you know people with dementia, the obvious question would be, well, why does this happen? What causes diseases like Alzheimer's disease? And at the moment, if you know people in that situation, you'll know that it's incurable. And so the question is, well, what research is being done, what are the prospects. And rather than go and look for a book on it, just try searching the internet. Be aware that this is a particularly hot topic because so many people suffer from dementia, and as people live longer, because we're better at treating lots of other diseases, more people have dementia than ever before. So research is very active. So look for recent articles. There's no point finding out what people thought about it in the 1990s. That's all long gone. So look for recent articles. And again, there's lots of nonsense out there about people saying, you just need to eat more apricots and it protects you against dementia or something. And most of it's rubbish. So make sure they're from reputable resources. And don't just pick one paper and read that and think, great, job done. Because almost certainly that's just what that particular researcher thinks, and lots of people may widely disagree. So you need to try and get a balance through from looking at lots of things. So again, go to the internet. So I just Googled recent advances in Alzheimer's. And you get dozens of pages, so I just picked 3 here as examples out of all the things that come up. So the top one is a review, but it's in Nature. Nature is a very serious, highly rated research journal, which is in the library here, in fact. So that's the advantage that you can find the original article easily. And it will be a good place to start, except that it's quite technical. So this was that paper that I picked up from there, and it sounds very promising, but when you get into it, what you discover is that it's aimed primarily at other people working in the field. So it gets quite technical in places. And so you might think, I'm finding it difficult to follow this and to decide what I really think about it. So it would be a good place to read, but if you find that it's too hard going, then you can go back to that list. And the second one on the list, which was from the Mayo Clinic, was this one. So you may not have heard of the Mayo Clinic, but if you just Google it, you discover it's a really big sort of prestigious health organization in the United States. So this is, again, it's a serious source, but this is written for a much more general audience. So this actually would have been an easier place to start. So that's the thing. Don't sort of find one article and think, right, I'm going to base it on this, because it may be brilliant, but it may be just too hard to follow, or it may promise more than it delivers. And quite often people put eye-catching titles and then sort of focus on one very narrow, specific thing, which you may not be that interested in. But this was quite a good sort of summary, which dealt with what the state of understanding of Alzheimer's is, and then what the prospects for treatment are. And so you might think, okay, so I want to understand a bit more about that, and you discover that there's big controversy about what the causes of Alzheimer's are. So the dominant theory is called the amyloid theory, which has to do with the fact that people with Alzheimer's have specific brain proteins which fall out of solution and form sort of solid aggregates in the brain. And it's thought by most people that those solid deposits of protein are the sort of toxic agent that causes the brain tissue to decay. But equally, quite a lot of people increasingly are starting to disagree with that. So you might think, okay, so I want to learn more about that. So then you go back to Google and you say, right, I'll Google the amyloid theory. And again, you don't just go to the first article, because the first article you find says, right, amyloid, 30 years of a breakthrough theory, so that sounds really positive. And then the second one says how the amyloid mafia took over Alzheimer's research, which is pointing you towards the fact that not everybody's going to agree with this. And you read the 2 articles, and this one basically is a celebration of the guy who invented the theory 30 odd years ago. So it takes a very positive view, because it was a huge leap forward in sort of understanding things that were happening during Alzheimer's disease. But it's been almost too influential, because what's happened is that all of the drug companies latched onto it, and all of their attempts to develop cures were based on this particular theory. And the drugs they've developed don't work very well. And so it's making people reassess um, what's going on. And this article, this magazine called Stat, again, you've probably never heard of, but it's a sort of serious medicine and biology news thing in the States. So again, if you just Google it, you can find out that it's thought to be reputable. And this was written by somebody who hates the amyloid theory and thinks that it's been disastrous for Alzheimer's that people have become so obsessed with it. So it's quite a biased article in that it's focusing on everything that's wrong with theory. But if you read that and you read the positive ones as well, then you can come up with a balanced view. So I'm not saying you all need to go away and understand about dementia. It was just an example. But the point I wanted to try and make is that you can find lots of interesting stuff using the internet. And I think that's a more positive thing to do than just reading books, and more interesting when you get to talk about it, when you get to interview. Okay, so we'll stop there for today.